At my daughter's wedding, the groom's father said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That old construction worker doesn't belong here with decent people." The bride's family laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. But my daughter Harper didn't laugh. She stood up, called off the wedding in front of everyone, and walked away. The next day, I did something that completely destroyed their family fortune. My name is Bryce Reynolds, I'm 58 years old, and let me tell you how a simple construction worker taught some rich folks a lesson they'll never forget. 3 months before that glorious disaster of a wedding, I was living my quiet life in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. At 58, I'd been retired from construction engineering for 3 years, spending my days maintaining my modest ranch house and working in my garage workshop. Most people in town knew me as Bryce Reynolds, the guy who'd worked 25 years designing and overseeing major construction projects throughout the Midwest. What they didn't know was that my modest lifestyle was hiding something that would have shocked everyone, especially the Clarke family. My daughter Harper had been dating Mason Clarke for about 8 months. I'd met him twice before he started planning their engagement like he was coordinating a corporate merger. The first time was at Harper's birthday dinner, where he spent the entire evening checking his phone and making comments about how quaint our family traditions were. The second meeting was when he brought his parents, Preston and Kennedy Clarke, over to get acquainted with Harper's family background. Preston swept into my house like he was touring a construction site, making helpful observations about updating my basic fixtures and asking if I'd considered hiring professionals to modernize the place. Meanwhile, Kennedy was examining my furniture and family photos like she was conducting a home inspection for insurance purposes. "Mr. Reynolds," Preston had said, settling into my recliner like he owned it, "we're just so pleased that Mason found someone who understands the importance of family values." He smiled that practiced smile that successful businessmen perfect by age 45. It's refreshing when working-class families can contribute what they can, even if it's just good old-fashioned work ethic. I nearly choked on my coffee. Here I was being patted on the head like a good little blue-collar worker who might be useful for manual labor around their estate someday. If they only knew that I'd been building a real estate portfolio for the past 12 years, while they were probably leveraging themselves to the hilt to maintain their lifestyle. Harper, bless her heart, was completely oblivious to the condescending undertones. She was so in love, she couldn't see that Mason looked at our family like we were a charity case he'd graciously decided to adopt. The girl had grown up thinking the best of everyone, a trait she'd inherited from her mother before cancer took her 12 years ago. But here's what the Clarke family didn't understand about Midwest construction engineers. We didn't survive 25 years in commercial building by being stupid about money or naive about people. We just let folks think we are because it's amazing what they'll say when they underestimate your intelligence. The engagement announcement came in November, and with it came Mason's first real mistake. He called me personally to share the wonderful news and informed me they'd already booked the Clarke family estate for a June wedding. Not asking if June worked for our side, mind you, just telling me what they'd decided. "Mr. Reynolds," Mason said over the phone, "we're so excited to make Harper part of our family. The Clarke estate can accommodate 250 guests easily, and Mother has already contacted the premier caterers in the state. Of course, we understand that your side of the family might have more modest expectations for this type of event." I made appropriate fatherly noises while mentally calculating exactly how modest Mason was about to discover my expectations could be. Because you see, my future son-in-law had made one crucial error in his research about Harper's family background. He'd never asked about my financial planning skills or what I'd been doing with my salary for the past 25 years. 2 weeks after Mason's condescending phone call, I was sitting in my financial advisor's office reviewing my annual portfolio statements when I realized exactly how I was going to handle my future son-in-law's superior attitude. The numbers on the page were quite satisfying. "Mr. Reynolds," Griffin Morrison said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed my investments, "you've done remarkably well with these real estate holdings. Your current net worth has reached $3.8 million. I smiled and nodded like this was routine information, but inside I was feeling pretty damn satisfied. My late wife Sarah had always said I had a good head for numbers and market timing, and apparently she'd been right. While everyone assumed I was living on my pension and savings, I'd been quietly building a fortune that would have made Preston Clarke soil his designer suits. The plan started forming in my mind like a blueprint for a complex building project. Harper called that afternoon, voice bright with excitement about meeting Mason's family properly before the wedding. "Dad, the Clarks want to have us over for dinner next weekend. Nothing fancy, just family." She paused. "Mason mentioned they have quite a bit of property out in West Hills. I think they're pretty wealthy." "I'm sure they're nice people," I said, already planning what I'd wear to this nothing fancy dinner party. "I'll just be myself." And that was exactly what I intended to do. The Clarke estate turned out to be one of those sprawling colonial mansions that screamed my great-grandfather made this fortune in the railroad boom, and we've been coasting on it ever since. The circular driveway could have parked a dozen cars, and the front garden looked like something from a magazine about gracious living. I pulled up in my reliable Ford F-150, the same truck I'd driven for work projects for years. Harper arrived separately in her modest sedan, both of us looking like we'd gotten lost on the way to the service entrance. Mason emerged from the front door wearing what I suspected was a $400 polo shirt, his smile bright enough to power the house's security lights. "Mr. Reynolds," he called, "welcome to our family home. Mom and Dad are so excited to meet you properly." The interior was all marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of furniture that costs more than most people make in 6 months. Kennedy Clarke glided down the grand staircase wearing pearls that probably cost more than Harper's annual teacher salary, with Preston trailing behind like a well-dressed shadow. "Bryce," Kennedy said, taking my hands like she was bestowing a blessing, "how wonderful to finally have a proper visit. Mason has told us so much about Harper's background." I'll bet he had. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 30 people, though it was just the 6 of us around one end of their mahogany table. The conversation flowed like expensive wine, with Kennedy and Preston sharing stories about their recent trip to Europe, while Mason hung on every word like they were recounting the secrets of the universe. "We simply adore traveling," Kennedy explained, cutting into what I suspected was $60 per pound steak. "Last fall we did the Mediterranean, and this spring we're planning something special for Preston's 60th. Perhaps a private villa in Tuscany." "Sounds nice," I said, taking a sip of wine that probably cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. Mason leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Reynolds, Harper mentioned you've never been outside the Midwest. We were thinking that after the wedding you might enjoy visiting us when we take trips, as family." The condescension was so thick you could have cut it with the silver butter knife. Here they were generously offering to include the poor blue-collar father in their glamorous lifestyle, probably expecting me to weep with gratitude. "That's thoughtful of you," I replied, wondering how they'd react to learning that I'd been considering buying a vacation property in Florida with my investment returns. But the real show began when Preston started talking about his business empire, 2 car dealerships, a restaurant, and what he called various real estate investments that were apparently doing quite well. He had that particular swagger that wealthy men get when they're showing off for someone they consider beneath them. "The key to building wealth, Bryce," he informed me, gesturing with his wine glass, "is understanding that money needs to work for you. Most people never figure that out. They work for wages their whole lives instead of making their capital generate returns." I nodded thoughtfully as if this was the first time I'd ever heard such wisdom, while mentally calculating that my real estate portfolio had probably outperformed his various investments by at least 20% over the past 5 years. That's when Kennedy delivered the line that sealed their fate. "Bryce, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I hope you don't feel intimidated by all this success. We want you to know that we don't expect Harper's side of the family to contribute equally to the wedding expenses. We understand the limitations of a construction worker's pension." The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on their precious marble floors. I felt something shift inside my chest. It was like a door slamming shut on 25 years of being underestimated, and another door opening onto something much more interesting. "How considerate," I said, setting down my wine glass with appropriate gratitude. I wouldn't want to overextend myself financially. After dinner, Kennedy insisted on the full house tour, really just an opportunity to show off their art collection and library full of leather-bound books that had probably never been opened. "The house has been in Preston's family for 4 generations, she explained, running her fingers along the marble mantelpiece. "We've updated it considerably, but we've maintained its historical character." "Beautiful place," I said honestly. You must feel fortunate to have such a legacy. Oh, we do, Mason chimed in. It's part of why Dad and I are so committed to family traditions. We want Harper to understand what it means to be part of something substantial. The message was clear. Harper was marrying up, way up, and her blue-collar family should be appropriately grateful for the elevation in social status. That's when I decided to start what I was already thinking of as project education. Mason, I said, I hope you won't think I'm presumptuous, but I'd love to contribute something special to your wedding, perhaps handle the rehearsal dinner. The three Clarks exchanged quick glances. Kennedy's smile became strained. Bryce, that's so sweet of you to offer, she said carefully. But the rehearsal dinner is already arranged. We thought it would be easier for us to handle all the details, given our experience with larger events. Of course, I nodded. Then perhaps I could handle the photography or the music. Preston cleared his throat. The thing is, Bryce, we've already contracted with the vendors we prefer to use. They're quite exclusive and probably more expensive than what you're accustomed to working with in your circle. There it was again. The gentle but firm message that my blue-collar budget and small-town vendors weren't up to Clarke family standards. I understand completely, I said, and I did. They wanted complete control while keeping Harper's family in the background, like embarrassing relatives you had to invite but hoped wouldn't embarrass you. What they didn't understand was that they just handed me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what Bryce Reynolds was capable of when properly motivated. Well then, I continued sweetly, perhaps I could give Harper and Mason a wedding gift instead, something that might help them start their new life together. Mason's eyes lit up like a slot machine hitting jackpot. I could practically see him calculating how much the old construction worker might scrape together. That would be wonderful, Mr. Reynolds, he said. Honestly, just having your blessing means the world to us. I smiled my most fatherly smile while making mental notes about what was going to be the most educational experience the Clarke family had ever encountered. The next morning I was sitting in my home office with fresh coffee, beginning my due diligence research. If the Clarks wanted to play the wealthy family superiority game, I figured I should understand exactly what kind of wealth I was dealing with. What I found was interesting. Preston's business empire, while impressive sounding, was built on surprisingly shaky foundations. His car dealerships were heavily leveraged, with one showing declining sales. His restaurant had mixed reviews and significant debt. The various real estate investments seemed to consist mainly of some rental properties and a small stake in a strip mall losing tenants to newer developments. The house was mortgaged to about 75% of its value. Kennedy's family money appeared to be more like family obligations, reduced by medical expenses and poor investment choices. The Clarks were wealthy, certainly, but they were what my financial advisor would call house rich and cash poor. They had assets, but substantial monthly payments and a lifestyle requiring constant cash flow. This information made me smile. I'd stopped worrying about being charitable around the time Kennedy explained the limitations of a construction worker's pension. I called Harper that afternoon to check in about wedding plans and fish for more information about her future in-laws. Dad, I have to ask, Harper said after we'd covered the basics. You seemed quiet at dinner last night. Is everything okay? I know the Clarks can be a little overwhelming. They seem like successful people, I said carefully. Mason's lucky to have grown up with such advantages. Yeah, it's pretty intimidating sometimes, Harper admitted. Preston's always talking about business deals and investment strategies. I feel like I need an MBA just to follow the conversation. Has Mason talked about your plans after the wedding, career goals, where you'll live? Actually, Preston offered him a management position at the main dealership, sales manager with the possibility of working up to partial ownership eventually. It's a huge opportunity, Dad. I felt a chill run down my spine. Of course, Preston had offered Mason a job. Nothing like having your son-in-law financially dependent on you to ensure family loyalty. That sounds generous, I said. It is. The only thing is, the salary is mostly commission-based to start, and they want us to move into this apartment complex closer to town so Mason can be available for weekend sales events. Always eventually with people like the Clarks. Meanwhile, Mason would be working for commission, living paycheck to paycheck, and completely dependent on Preston's continued goodwill. Have you signed anything yet? I asked. Not yet. Preston wants to wait until after the wedding to make it official. He says it's bad luck to mix business with family celebrations. Or maybe Preston wanted to make sure the wedding happened before he locked Mason into an employment contract that would give him complete control over my daughter's future. That evening, I called Griffin with a very specific request. Griffin, I said, I want to liquidate $500,000 from my real estate portfolio. I know that's substantial, but I have something important I want to do with it. Bryce, that's quite a withdrawal. What did you have in mind? This is an investment in Harper's future. I want to give the kids a wedding gift that will really set them up for success. What I didn't tell Griffin was that the gift was going to set them up for success in ways that Mason and his family would never see coming. While the Clarke family had been busy being condescending, I'd been researching more than just their financial situation. I'd also been looking into Preston's business competitors, the local commercial real estate market, and some very interesting development opportunities. 1 week before the wedding, I was sitting in my lawyer's office reviewing papers that would have made Preston Clarke very nervous if he'd known they existed. Everything is in order, Bryce, my attorney Paige Williams said, sliding the documents across her desk. Reynolds Investment Group is legally established, Mason is listed as the primary beneficiary, and the initial funding is confirmed. I looked at the papers that would transform Mason from Preston's financially dependent employee into an independently wealthy businessman. Paige, I said, I've spent 12 years watching my investments grow while people assumed I was just another retired construction worker living on his pension. I think it's time Mason learned that his father-in-law isn't quite as simple as everyone believes. The plan was beautifully elegant. Instead of Mason taking Preston's commission-based job, he would become managing partner of Reynolds Investment Group, a company that would purchase several strategic properties in Cedar Rapids, including the strip mall where Preston held his small stake. The wedding gift would be presented as a modest check that Harper and Mason could use for whatever they wanted. What they wouldn't know until after the honeymoon was that the check would be backed by a business structure that would make Mason independently wealthy within 18 months. But first, I had a wedding to attend and a performance to complete. The morning of Harper's wedding dawned bright and clear. I'd spent the previous evening pressing my simple father-of-the-bride suit, a modest navy ensemble that would help maintain my carefully crafted image for just a few more hours. I arrived at the Clarke estate at 10 a.m., carrying a wedding card containing what appeared to be a modest check for $10,000. What they couldn't see was the additional paperwork in my truck that would transfer Mason from Preston's employee to Preston's business competitor by Monday morning. The estate was buzzing with activity. Florists were arranging $40,000 worth of roses throughout the grounds. Caterers were setting up stations that could have fed half of Cedar Rapids, and a string quartet was doing sound checks where the ceremony would take place. Kennedy was directing traffic like a general commanding troops, while Harper floated around in a silk robe, accepting compliments on her transformation from teacher to society wife. "Bryce," Kennedy called, spotting me near the gift table, "how lovely that you're here early." Harper specifically wanted her family to feel included in all the preparations. Feel included. Right. "How thoughtful," I said, placing my card among the collection of envelopes. "Is there anything I can help with?" "Oh, how sweet of you to offer," Kennedy gushed. "But we have everything well in hand. Professional coordination, you understand. We wouldn't want any mishaps on such an important day. Translation, stay out of the way and let the competent people handle things." I smiled and nodded while mentally reviewing my timeline. Reynolds Investment Group now owned controlling interest in 3 commercial properties in Cedar Rapids, including the retail development that Preston thought was his nest egg. Harper found me an hour before the ceremony, looking nervous and beautiful in her wedding dress. "Dad," she said, giving me a hug, "I'm glad you're here. This whole thing is pretty overwhelming." "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I assured her. "Mason's a lucky man." "I hope so," she said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not sophisticated enough for all this, like I don't belong in their world." My heart broke a little for my daughter, who'd been systematically convinced by the Clarke family that she should be grateful for their acceptance rather than confident in her own worth. "Harper," I said firmly, "you belong anywhere you choose to belong. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The ceremony was set to begin at 4 p.m. I spent the afternoon observing the Clarke family dynamics with the clinical interest of someone who'd studied his opponents. Preston held court with wealthy guests, discussing business deals, while Kennedy showed off her daughter-in-law's elaborate wedding. At 3:45, I took my designated seat in the front row, carefully positioned so I wouldn't interfere with the photographer's shots of the important relatives. That's when Preston Clarke made the mistake that would cost his family everything they thought they owned. He was standing near the gift table, chatting with his brother about wedding expenses, when he spotted me in my front row seat. I watched his expression change as he took in my modest suit, my simple appearance, my complete lack of obvious wealth or social status. And then he said the words that sealed his family's fate, speaking just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear clearly. "Look at that poor bastard," Preston murmured to his brother, nodding in my direction. "Sitting there in his discount suit, trying so hard to look appropriate. That old construction worker doesn't belong here with decent people." The words hit me like a physical slap, but what followed was even more revealing. Kennedy, overhearing Preston's comment as she approached for final pre-ceremony photos, actually laughed and nodded in agreement. "Preston, you're terrible," she giggled. "But honestly, he does look like he got lost on the way to a union meeting." That's when Mason, who had been adjusting his boutonniere nearby, went completely still. I watched my future son-in-law's face change as he processed what his parents had just said about his bride's father. The uncertainty disappeared, replaced by something much harder and more determined than I'd ever seen in his expression. What happened next unfolded like a controlled demolition. Mason walked away from his position near the altar, his face set in an expression I'd never seen before, and headed straight for the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony readings. The string quartet faltered to a stop as Mason tapped the microphone, the sound echoing across the elaborately decorated terrace where 200 guests had gathered to witness his wedding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mason said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence, "I need to make an announcement." Harper, still holding her bouquet and wearing her $8,000 dress, looked confused rather than alarmed, like this was some kind of romantic surprise she hadn't been informed about. "Mason, darling," she called out, "what are you doing? The ceremony is supposed to start." He looked at her for a long moment, and I saw something fundamental change in his expression. "Harper," he said into the microphone, 2 minutes ago I heard my parents discussing your father's appearance. They called him an old construction worker who doesn't belong here with decent people, and they laughed about how he looked like he got lost on the way to a union meeting. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the marble terrace. Kennedy's face went white, then red, then white again as she realized that half of Cedar Rapids' social elite had just heard her exposed as the cruel person she actually was. "Mason, that wasn't, we were just," she stammered, but he held up his hand to stop her. "Harper's father," Mason continued, his voice getting stronger, raised her alone after her mother died. "He worked 25 years as a construction engineer, never complained, never asked for anything in return, and has been nothing but gracious and supportive about this wedding, despite being treated like an unwelcome charity case by my family." Preston tried to interrupt, rushing toward the microphone, but Mason stepped away and kept talking. "I just realized that I can't marry someone whose family would mock my wife's father, and I can't join a family that thinks cruelty is entertaining," he said. "So I'm calling off this wedding right here, right now." The gasp from the assembled guests sounded like a collective intake of breath before a scream. Harper dropped her bouquet and stared at Mason in shock. "Mason, you can't be serious," she whispered. "You're ruining everything over a comment." "I'm serious," he said quietly, removing his boutonniere. "And it wasn't just a comment. It was who they really are when they think no one important is listening." That's when Preston made his crucial mistake. He stepped forward, his face red with rage, and pointed a finger at Mason like he was disciplining an employee. "You ungrateful little nobody," Preston snarled. "We've given you everything. A future, a career, acceptance into our family, and this is how you repay us? By humiliating us in front of our friends?" Mason looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Clarke," he said, "you offered me a commission-based job that would have made me financially dependent on your goodwill for the rest of my life. That's not generosity, that's control." I felt pride swell in my chest as I watched this young man stand up to people who'd spent months making him feel grateful for their attention. But Preston wasn't finished. "Control?" He laughed harshly. "Son, you have no idea what control looks like. You just threw away the best opportunity you'll ever get. You think your blue-collar background and your construction worker father-in-law are going to open doors for you? He gestured dismissively in my direction, and that's when I decided it was time to stop being invisible. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my discount suit, and walked toward the microphone with the calm confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a game other people don't even realize they're playing. "Mason," I said gently, "would you mind if I said a few words?" He handed me the microphone with a smile that told me he was ready to hear whatever Harper's father had to say. I looked out at the assembled guests, Cedar Rapids' wealthiest families and business leaders who'd come to witness what they thought would be the social event of the season. First, I said, "I want to thank the Clarke family for hosting such an educational afternoon. It's been very illuminating to see how certain people behave when they think they have all the power in a situation." Kennedy's face was now an alarming shade of purple, while Harper looked like she was going to faint. "Preston," I continued, looking directly at him, "you're right that control is important in business relationships. That's why I spent this week purchasing your stake in the Riverside Commons development project." The color drained from Preston's face like someone had pulled a plug. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "I'm talking about Reynolds Investment Group," I said pleasantly, "which now owns controlling interest in 3 major commercial developments in Cedar Rapids, including the one you've been counting on for your retirement funding." I turned to address the crowd, most of whom were staring at me like I'd just announced I was an alien. You see, Preston was right about one thing. It is important to understand how money works. My limitation is that I don't tolerate people who mistake blue-collar work for blue-collar thinking, or modest living for modest means. The silence stretched until you could have heard a butterfly land on the roses. "Mason," I said, handing him back the microphone, "your wedding gift is in my truck. I think you'll find it provides better opportunities than anything the Clarke family was offering." I walked back to my seat and waited for the real show to begin. Preston was now following me toward my truck, his face flushed with panic. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Preston hissed. "You can't just make wild claims about business acquisitions." I unlocked my F-150 and retrieved a leather portfolio from behind the seat. "Preston," I said calmly, "I never make claims I can't support with documentation." I handed him the stack of papers I'd been looking forward to sharing for weeks. His hands trembled as he read the investment contracts and business incorporation documents that legally established Reynolds Investment Group as a major player in the local commercial real estate market. "This is impossible," he whispered. "These properties. Do you have any idea how much capital this represents?" "Approximately $2.1 million in initial investments," I said helpfully, "with projected returns of roughly $6.8 million over the next 18 months, depending on how current property owners negotiate their exit strategies." Mason had approached during this conversation, still wearing his wedding tuxedo but looking more confident than I'd seen him in months. "Mr. Reynolds," he said quietly, "what exactly is Reynolds Investment Group?" "It's your wedding gift," I said, handing him a separate folder. "Congratulations. You're now the managing partner of a business that owns more commercial real estate than Preston's entire empire." Mason's mouth fell open as he scanned the documents. "Son," I said gently, "your construction engineer father-in-law has been building wealth for 12 years while everyone assumed I was living on my pension and workshop projects. Compound interest and strategic real estate investment are wonderful things when you're patient and smart about timing." "You mean," Mason said slowly, "you've been pretending to be poor this whole time?" "Not pretending to be poor," I corrected, "living modestly while building wealth quietly. There's a difference between having money and showing off money, though some people never learn that distinction." 1 month later, I was sitting in the conference room of Reynolds Investment Group watching Mason conduct a business meeting with the confidence that comes from knowing you own the building you're sitting in. Harper had called off from teaching to help run the family business, and they'd postponed their wedding plans indefinitely. "The Medical Plaza expansion is ahead of schedule," Mason was explaining to our development partners. "We should be ready for the consolidated buyout by early spring." After the meeting, Mason and I sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports that showed Reynolds Investment Group was now worth approximately $7.2 million and growing. "Mr. Reynolds," Mason said, "I still can't believe you orchestrated all this while letting everyone think you were just the modest, retired construction worker." "The construction work was real," I pointed out. "I do actually enjoy building things with my hands. But the rest of it, the 12 years of investment planning, the business strategy, the timing of the Clarke family takedown, you're right. I orchestrated all of it." Speaking of the Clarks, Mason said, I heard they had to sell the estate last month. I made appropriate noises, though I wasn't particularly surprised. When you're leveraged to maintain a lifestyle and your key investments suddenly become less profitable, adjustments have to be made. Do you ever feel bad about how things worked out for them? Mason asked. I considered the question seriously. I feel bad that they chose to treat people with cruelty and condescension. The financial consequences were their own choices. I simply gave them the opportunity to compete in a market where their assumptions about other people's capabilities turned out to be wrong. That evening, I was sitting on my front porch, watching the sunset and thinking about the journey from that condescending dinner party to today's successful business meeting. 12 years of careful planning, months of strategic patience, and one perfectly timed revelation had transformed not just Mason and Harper's future, but our entire family's legacy. Bryce Reynolds had started this story as a construction engineer pretending to be simple. He was ending it as a businessman who'd proven that underestimating blue-collar intelligence was the most expensive mistake the Clarke family had ever made. And honestly, that felt like exactly the right ending.